Oh, well, it looks like I didn't scare too many people off, so that's good. That's good. Welcome back. This morning I want to talk with you about something that is very, very important in apologetics, and that is logical fallacies. It will really change your approach to apologetics if you really understand logic and how to spot logical fallacies. The Christian, after all, has a moral obligation to be rational, to think God's thoughts after him, to think in a way that is consistent with God. And this is particularly useful in an apologetic situation because evolutionists commit logical fallacies left and right. And I don't mean that as a slam on their intelligence, because I know many brilliant scientists who happen to believe in evolution, but when it comes to origins, it's just like logic goes out the window, and you just see logical fallacies left and right. And I think one of the reasons they do this is because they don't have any good arguments for their position, so they use fallacies. But another reason is because we let them. Most Christians don't know how to identify logical fallacies and how to point it out. And if you do that, boy, it really changes the way the debate goes. And something else that's important too, creationists are not immune from logical fallacies. And I've heard a number of creationists make logical fallacies as well. And it's sort of embarrassing when you hear somebody advocating your position, but they do it poorly. What I'd like to do then today is cover the basics of logic, and maybe some of you have had classes on logic, but I'm presuming that most of you probably have not had a class on logic, and so I want to bring you up to speed on some terminology and so on and so forth. Then we'll cover specific logical fallacies that frequently occur in an apologetic situation. So logic is the study of the principles of correct and therefore incorrect reasoning. It's the chain of reasoning, not specific evidences that are used within an argument. In other words, what conclusions can we reasonably infer or deduce from accepted facts? If somebody says, I found a fossil of a mammal inside the fossil of a dinosaur, therefore I think the dinosaur ate the mammal. And what logic would study is not the fossils or not the, it wouldn't go out and verify the claims. Rather, it would study, is that a reasonable conclusion to draw from that accepted fact, from that accepted claim anyway. Knowing logic will revolutionize the way that you defend the faith. It's very important. So some terms here. We need to understand a proposition. Proposition is a statement that affirms or denies something, and as such it is either true or false. And so, for example, the sky is blue. That's a proposition. It's affirming the sky is blue. All dogs are purple. Is that a proposition? Yes. It is, because it's affirming something. Now, what it happens to be affirming is false. That's a false proposition, but it is affirming something, so it's a proposition. The number of stars in the visible universe is an even number. Is that a proposition? Is it true or false? We don't know if it's true or false, but it is either true or false, and so it is a proposition. It's just that the truth value of that proposition is known only to God and no one else. Commands, like do your homework, or questions, is the sky blue, are not propositions because they're not affirming or denying anything. The proposition is the meaning of the statement. It has nothing to do with the specific words used. So the sky is blue. It is the case that the sky is blue. Blue is the sky. You say it in another language. Those are all the same proposition because they all have the same meaning. An argument is a group of propositions where the truth of one is claimed to follow from the others. And a lot of times when people think of an argument, they think of a sort of a heated thing, a yelling match, as it were. But that's not what we're talking about when we talk about a logical argument. Biblically, we are supposed to argue. We're supposed to make a case, make a defense of the faith, contend earnestly for the faith. The Bible tells us to do that. So although we're to argue, and we're to contend for the faith, we're not to be argumentative or contentious. It's sort of a shame those words sound similar, but they have a very different meaning. We are supposed to contend for the faith, to make an argument. Here's an example of an argument. There are 3 propositions here. The first one says all mammals have kidneys. The second one says all dogs are mammals. And the third one says, therefore, all dogs have kidneys. That's a good argument. That's a deductive syllogism. A syllogism is where you have 2 premises and then the conclusion there in the argument. So that's a good argument. The claim being demonstrated in the argument is the conclusion. That's step 3 there. Therefore, in conclusion, a lot of times you recognize that because it'll have a word like therefore or thus or so or hence. Not always. It doesn't have to. It's just those are tip-offs that you're dealing with the conclusion of the argument. And the other propositions that provide support are called premises. And so this is premise 1 and this is premise 2. And then you have the conclusion. And it's a syllogism because there are 2 premises and 1 conclusion. So that's an argument. A fallacy then is a common error in the chain of reasoning. It's not necessarily a false proposition, but rather a fallacy would be when the conclusion does not follow from the premises, even if the premises are true. So for example, some mammals are cats, that's true. All dogs are mammals, that's true. Therefore, some dogs are cats. That's an example of a fallacy. It's a common error in the chain of reasoning. Now that one's pretty obvious because you know some dogs are not cats, and so the conclusion is obviously wrong. Whenever you have true premises and a false conclusion, it's definitely a fallacy because it's not flowing. But there are other ways you can have fallacies too. A fallacy just means the argument doesn't follow. The conclusion does not follow from the premises. This particular fallacy, the fallacy of the undistributed middle, does not occur often in apologetic situations, so it's not one we're going to cover specifically. But if I'd disguised it, if I'd given different words here, it might not have been immediately obvious that it's a fallacy. I picked an obvious one because you know that some dogs are not cats. You know that that's not the case. But if I'd used a similar argument, it might have been disguised, and therefore it'd be hard to catch. And that's what makes it seductive. Logical fallacies tend to be persuasive. People tend to think that, yeah, that follows, when in fact it doesn't. And that's what makes them common errors in reasoning. An argument is valid if the conclusion does follow from the premises, and otherwise it is invalid. And so we want to be using valid arguments where it does follow. So if it's a fallacy, it's invalid. All mammals are reptiles. All dogs are mammals. Therefore, all dogs are reptiles. Is that valid? It is valid because the conclusion does follow from the premises, even though the first premise is false. It does follow. And I wanted to make sure you understand something. There are 2 ways that an argument can be bad. It can have a fallacy, an error in the chain of reasoning, which this one does not, or it can have a false premise, which this one does. Premise 1 is wrong, and therefore the conclusion is unreliable. And so make sure you understand that. Always watch for those 2 things, a bad premise, a false premise, or an error in the chain of reasoning. Either one of those will make a bad argument. But this is not, see, valid doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good argument. It just means that it follows. It could still have a faulty premise. So we want to use an argument that is not only valid, but also sound. A sound argument is valid and has true premises, and so therefore the conclusion must be true in a sound argument. And if it has either a false premise or a bad chain of reasoning, it's unsound. And so is this argument, just a few examples here to drill it home. Is this argument valid? Is it sound? All mammals have kidneys. All dogs are mammals. Therefore, all dogs have kidneys. Valid? Yes. Sound? Yes. Because the premises are true and the conclusion follows from them. All mammals are reptiles. All dogs are mammals. Therefore, all dogs are reptiles. Valid? Yes. Sound? No. Good. Okay, you got it. How about this one? All dogs are cats. Some cats are chickens. Therefore, the sky is blue. Valid? No. Okay, that's easy. But I wanted you to notice something in this. The conclusion is true. Okay? So be careful. Even an invalid argument can have, by accident, a true conclusion. So it would be better to say that an invalid argument does not have a reliable conclusion. The conclusion is not guaranteed to be true because it doesn't follow. All dogs are mammals. All cats have kidneys. Therefore, the sky is blue. Valid? No, because there's no chain of reasoning there at all. You cannot draw this conclusion from these premises. But every proposition there is true, you see. And so, again, valid concerns the chain of reasoning. And so it's not sound either because it's not valid, and therefore it's not sound. There are 2 kinds of logic. Deductive and inductive, well, there's abductive and so on, but those are the kinds that commonly occur. And in a deductive or formal argument, the conclusion is definitely true if the premises are. And that's what we've been talking about so far, the all mammals and so on. Those are deductive arguments. An inductive argument is probabilistic in nature. It argues that the conclusion is very likely to be true given the premises. And most of the arguments we'll deal with are inductive. These are also called formal and informal because with the deductive variety, it can be put into sort of an algebraic notation like if P then Q. It's easier than algebra, but it's the same kind of notation, and those are forms, so it's formal. And with an inductive argument, it does not use forms. It uses ordinary language, and so those are ordinary language type arguments. A deductive argument is either valid or invalid, as we discussed. It's either sound or unsound, and a sound argument always has a true conclusion. With an inductive argument, we use different language, though, because an inductive argument can't be valid because that means the conclusion definitely follows. But an inductive argument isn't trying to definitely assert the conclusion. It's only saying it's likely. And so with an inductive argument, it's either strong or weak. It's strong if the conclusion really is likely to follow and weak otherwise. So we want to be using either strong inductive arguments or sound deductive arguments. An inductive argument is probabilistic in nature, and additional information can change a strong argument to a weak one and vice versa. And that's not really the case with deductive arguments. Let me give you an example of an inductive argument. Dr. Lyle has not answered his phone all day, therefore he is probably out of the office today. Now that seems like that's a pretty strong argument, isn't it? Because if I were there, you'd think I'd pick up, unless I give you an additional premise. What if I add another premise there? Dr. Lyle's not answered his phone all day. Dr. Lyle never answers his phone, even when he's in the office. Now suddenly that conclusion doesn't seem so likely, does it? Suddenly that argument has changed from a strong argument to a weak argument. Now all of this has been by way of introduction, just to give you a brief overview of logic. And I want to move on now and talk about inductive logic and what we call informal logical fallacies or ordinary language fallacies, because they do not use that formal notation. And there are three sort of categories of ordinary language fallacies: fallacies of ambiguity, fallacies of presumption, and fallacies of relevance. And we'll go through and talk about some of the specific fallacies that occur in each of these categories. Fallacies of ambiguity include equivocation, amphibole, accent, division, composition, and reification. And with a fallacy of ambiguity, there is something unclear in the argument. Something is vague or confusing about the words or the grammar. And we won't have time to cover all of these. And in fact, most of these don't occur in apologetic situations. The ones that really occur in apologetic situations are equivocation and reification. Those are very common. And so those are the ones that I'm going to talk about today. So let's start with reification. Well, I forgot I was going to move on and talk about fallacies of presumption as well. Fallacies of presumption, where the argument assumes something that is unwarranted. And here we have, these are the ones that we're going to cover, the ones in white. And because those are more common. The book, by the way, covers all of those. So when you read the book, Ultimate Proof of Creation, there are 2 chapters on logical fallacies in that book, and it covers all of those. And then fallacies of relevance, where the conclusion is not strongly related to the premises, although on the surface it seems to be. And we'll cover almost all of those. Genetic fallacy occurs too. I just don't have time to do all of them. So, okay, fallacies of ambiguity, we're going to cover equivocation and reification. Let's start with equivocation, the fallacy of shifting the meaning of a word within an argument, also called the bait and switch, because you bait somebody on one meaning and then you switch it to the other meaning. And so here's an example of equivocation. Practice makes perfect. Doctors practice medicine, therefore doctors are perfect. What word switched meaning? Practice, yeah, because it's being used in 2 different senses there, and it's switched it in the argument. Here's another example. Doctors know a lot about medicine. Dr. Lyle is a doctor, therefore Dr. Lyle knows a lot about medicine, which really is not true, because the word doctor, again, can either mean medical doctor, it can mean a PhD doctor. And so the word has a switched meaning there. It's the fallacy of equivocation. Now, something else, maybe you caught this. I said I was going to do informal fallacies. That's actually a formal argument, because a lot of these informal fallacies will transfer over to formal arguments anyway. Equivocation is one that does that. Although it's given a different name. It's called the fallacy of 4 terms, but it's the same thing. This fallacy is very common in evolutionary arguments. Evolutionists will equivocate on the word evolution, which can mean descent from a common ancestor, or it can mean change in a sort of generic sense. I know evolution is true because we see evolution happening all the time. Every day things change, right? Or creationists don't believe in evolution, but hey, we see evolution every day. Every day organisms change. That's an example of the fallacy of equivocation on the word evolution. I know evolution is true, molecules to man, because we see dogs changing into dogs. What doesn't follow, does it? If you put in the actual meaning of those words, the argument does not follow. Either meaning of the word evolution is legitimate, but you should not conflate them within an argument. Here's another example. You believe in science, don't you? Well, evolution is science, so you should believe in evolution. Do we believe in science? Yes, by which we mean the tools that God has given us, the procedure of science. Is evolution science? Well, in a sense, it's a particular model of origins, but you see, it's a different type of science, isn't it? It's one model of origin science versus the tools and procedures by which we acquire knowledge in certain areas. So that's the fallacy of equivocation. Evolution is a theory, sure, but so is gravity, and you believe in that, don't you? I've heard a lot of evolutionists say that one. They're conflating the word theory, which can mean in sort of ordinary language just a guess, but in the scientific definition would be something that's well established, something that has experimental support. And by the way, Christians commit this fallacy too. And therefore, I don't think we should say evolution is just a theory. I don't think we should say that because people will take that to mean it's a theory in a scientific sense, which it isn't. Because again, a theory has observational support, and I would argue evolution doesn't, really. So it's not a theory in a scientific sense. It's an unsubstantiated conjecture about the past. That's what it is. And so we don't want to conflate that word within the argument. Reification, a very common fallacy, perhaps one you've not heard of before, but you'll recognize it. This is where we attribute concrete characteristics to an abstraction, and these characteristics are often personal. You're personifying something that is abstract. And as an example of this, it's not nice to fool Mother Nature. You heard that one before? It's not nice to fool Mother Nature. But of course, nature is not a mother, and it's not something that can be fooled because nature does not have a mind. Nature is an abstraction, a name we give to the sum total of events of the universe. And so you really can't fool nature. This is reification. Though Dr. Lyle was on vacation, his job continued to call to him, luring him back to the office. But of course, a job doesn't have a mind and cannot do anything. It can't do what's attributed to it in this particular example. So this is reification. Now, there's nothing wrong with reification in and of itself. As a figure of speech in poetic literature, in fact, the Bible uses reification. In Proverbs 8, for example, it personifies wisdom. Wisdom calls and so on and so forth. There's nothing wrong with that because Proverbs is written in a poetic way. But if you use reification in an argument, it is a fallacy because it obscures important facts within the argument. So if an evolutionist says, here's an example of a fallacy of reification. This evidence says evolution's true. And the evidence says, I said no such thing, right? Kind of a double reification there, but hopefully you get the point. So evidence doesn't say anything, does it? Evidence is a concept, a name we give to certain facts that we think are consistent with a particular point of view. Evolution figured out a way around these problems. I've seen that type of phrase in evolutionary literature. Evolution figured out something. Evolution's a concept. It doesn't have a mind. It can't figure out anything. So that's the fallacy of reification. Life will find a way. That famous line from one of the Jurassic Park movies, life will find a way. Well, an organism might find a way because an organism has a mind, but life as a concept is not going to find a way because life is a concept, okay? It's not going to do that. It doesn't have that power. Nature selects those individuals that are most fit for the environment. We've heard that one a lot. It's actually the fallacy of reification because you're attributing a mental property to nature as if nature could choose and pick. But nature's a concept. Now, we do believe in natural selection, but when it's used that way, it's reification. The evidence speaks for itself is the fallacy of reification. Evidence does not speak. And if it did, you should run away. Run. Evidence does not speak. Be afraid if evidence speaks. Natural selection guided the development. Natural selection guided? Natural selection is a concept. It doesn't guide anything, really. Now, we do believe in the concept of natural selection, you understand. But to say that natural selection guides or nature selects, technically it's the fallacy of reification. Science is atheistic in its outlook and procedures. I got that one from an actual email that somebody had sent to me. Science is atheistic in its outlook and procedures. Science has beliefs about God? Really? If it did, it certainly wouldn't be an atheist, right? Science does not have beliefs about God. It's a tool. Science says. Creationists say this, but science says that. Ever heard people say that before? Science does not say anything. Scientists say things. Science says nothing. It's a tool that we use. Then we have fallacies of presumption. This is where the argument presumes something that is unwarranted. The argument might become a good argument if you add additional information, but when that information is missing, it's fallacy. And so let's do just a few of the fallacies in this category. Bifurcation, also called the false dilemma or the either-or fallacy. And this is falsely assuming that there are only two mutually exclusive options when in fact that's not the case. So as a silly example, either the traffic light is red or it is green would be the fallacy of bifurcation, because it could be yellow. Yeah. Either Bob will go into the ministry or he will move to Kansas. Well, it seems to me maybe Bob will go into the ministry and move to Kansas. Maybe those are not mutually exclusive options. What about this one? What about Jesus when he says, "You're either for me or you're against me"? Is that the fallacy of bifurcation? No. You know it's not a fallacy, because you know God can't commit a fallacy. He can't make a mistake in reasoning. But it sounds like it, doesn't it? But keep in mind that bifurcation, if I back up, is falsely assuming that there are only two options. Now, God is in a position to tell us if there are only two options. And God tells us you're either for him or you're against him. So that's not the fallacy of bifurcation. Here's an evolutionist example of this. He says, "I don't live by faith, I'm rational." But in saying that, this critic assumes we either live by faith or we're rational, the either-or fallacy. Why not live by faith and be rational? In fact, I would argue that without faith in the biblical God, you can't be rational. Not fully, because laws of logic stem from God's nature, as we saw in the last session. I cannot accept the Bible because I believe in science. Either the Bible or science. That's bifurcation. I believe in the tools of science because I believe in the Bible, because I believe God upholds the universe in a consistent fashion. So there's no problem there. Another common one, either the universe operates in a law-like fashion or God is constantly performing miracles. You can't have it both ways, creation. Either the universe operates in a strictly law-like fashion, which makes science possible, or there's a God who's constantly intervening and so on. What seems to me, the universe could operate in a law-like fashion most of the time, and God occasionally performs a miracle. And by the way, miracles are not necessarily suspension of the laws of nature anyway, but that's a whole separate topic that we could get in on. God certainly has the power to change natural laws if he wants to. It's not a problem. But he does this rarely, apparently, for our benefit. Another very good example, the Bible teaches that in Christ all things hold together, but we now know that the forces of gravity and electromagnetism are what hold the universe together. I actually had a Christian try to get me on this one, because he was asking me about the nature of gravity and why orbits work, and I was explaining how the gravity of a star pulls back the planet. He says, "Oh, I got you there, Dr. Lau, because the Bible says it's in Christ that all things hold together." And I had to explain to him, actually, that's the fallacy of bifurcation. Gravity is the name we give to the way that God upholds the universe. Laws of logic or laws of nature are not a replacement for God's power. They are God's power. They're an example of God's power. So it's not gravity or God's power. It's gravity because of God's power. So that's a fantastic example, I believe, of bifurcation, one that you should keep in mind. Because a lot of times, evolutionists will try to pin you. It's either this or that. You need to say, that's not the case. You've made a false dilemma there, a fallacy of bifurcation. Begging the question, circular reasoning, where the conclusion of an argument is incorporated into the premise or the premise depends upon the conclusion. You've sort of smuggled the conclusion of your argument into one of its premises. And of course, that's not legitimate. We know that evolution is true because it's a scientific fact. Right? And of course, that's just a restatement of the premise, isn't it? The conclusion just restates the premise. Or we know evolution is true because the alternative, creation, is impossible. Now, if they did know that creation is impossible, that would be a good argument. But the fact is, by just assuming it, they're just effectively restating that evolution is true, because that's the only alternative. Christians are not above begging the question. I've heard Christians say, well, the Bible says it's the Word of God, and what it says must be true, since God wouldn't lie. Now, I want you to understand something. Both of those statements are true. Those are both true propositions. Yes, the Bible does claim to be the Word of God, and yet God wouldn't lie. That's true. But when you use one as the sole support for the other, it's a circular argument. It's begging the question. And if you don't believe that's fallacious, try it with the Quran, because it'll work there too. The Quran says it's the Word of God, and hey, God wouldn't lie, so it must be. And we would deny that, wouldn't we? We'd say that's not a good argument. So even though the propositions are true, it's not a good argument. It's begging the question. And evolutionists do this all the time. They'll say, well, supernatural miracles cannot happen. How do you know that? Well, because they'd violate the laws of nature. Well, yeah, that's the point, isn't it? Yeah. But you see, he's merely assumed that nothing can go against the laws of nature in order to argue that nothing can go against the laws of nature. His conclusion is just a restatement of the premise. Almost all old earth arguments commit this fallacy, at least indirectly. And I say almost just to protect myself. As far as I know, there are no exceptions. Old earth arguments are based on circular reasoning. Why? Old earth arguments are all based on some degree of uniformitarianism, the idea that rates and conditions are generally constant, no worldwide flood, and naturalism, the belief that nature is all that there is, and therefore the laws of nature are what created the world, and so on and so forth. But these are unbiblical assumptions. And so to then argue that the biblical timescale is wrong is circular. Because you see, the old earth creationist has assumed that the Bible is wrong or not to be read in a straightforward fashion in order to argue that the Bible is wrong and cannot be read in a straightforward fashion. Because by assuming uniformitarianism and naturalism, he's already presumed that the Bible's wrong. He's presumed what he's trying to conclude, or at least the biblical timescale is wrong. Time to put on your thinking caps here. Time to get a little philosophical. Begging the question is very unusual because it's actually valid. With all the other fallacies, they're not valid. The chain of reasoning is bad, right? Or they're not cogent, they're not strong, they're weak arguments. But in the case of begging the question, the conclusion does follow from the premise because it's just a restatement of the premise. So it's actually valid. That's kind of weird, isn't it? And so that should make you think about, why is this really a fallacy? If it's valid, why do we call it a fallacy? And I think the answer would be, well, first of all, let me surprise you by saying I think there are cases of circular reasoning that are perfectly legitimate, and that may surprise you. But we'll see that in one of the other sessions later in the week. But I'll actually demonstrate that there are actually correct forms of circular reasoning. But for the most part, begging the question is not considered legitimate because it's arbitrary. Since the premises merely assume the conclusion, this form of reasoning is arbitrary. It's merely assuming what is trying to be proved. So when somebody begs the question, you could say, excuse me, sir or ma'am, but you've merely assumed what you're trying to prove, and that's not much of an argument. So that's why it's a fallacy, because it's arbitrary. Not because it's invalid, but because it's arbitrary. There are two subcategories of begging the question. One of these is called the question-begging epithet. An epithet is a word or phrase used as a term of abuse or contempt to express hostility. So in a question-begging epithet, you're using biased language to support a conclusion that is logically unproved. And for example, if somebody says, this criminal is charged with the vicious murder of the innocent victim, that would be the fallacy of the question-begging epithet. Because he could have said, I mean, that's very charged language, isn't it? You got vicious murder, innocent victim, criminal. Maybe he's just a suspect. Maybe he's not a criminal, right? And so that would be an example of the question-begging epithet. He could have said, the suspect is charged with killing the other person. That would have been a little bit more, or a little bit less biased, a little bit more neutral. I know there's no exactly neutral. Here's a guy who says, I pray you'll have an epiphany and stop misleading people to believe in nonsense and lies. That's actually an email that came into Answers in Genesis, so I like to display those. But of course, he's presumed that what we're teaching is nonsense and lies. He hasn't proved it, and so it's a question-begging epithet. Dr. Purdom gave me permission to use this one. This is somebody who criticized one of her debates that she did. She did very well on a debate against this evolutionist. And this person says, this woman received her PhD in molecular genetics from Ohio State. Our department is becoming infested with creationists. You see how that emotional language there is saying how, it gives you an emotional edge, but there's no logic to this. It says perhaps they are becoming attracted to our program after noticing that we graduated this nitwit. But there's no logic there, is there? There's not a logical argument. It's just using emotional language instead of logic. If you want to see question-begging epithets, take a look at evolutionary blogs. Internet blogs. They are full of question-begging epithets. People using emotional language to use something that's logically unproved. Question-begging epithets can be subtle. Evolution versus creationism. We've heard that one a lot. That's a fallacy. Because by attaching ism to creation and not evolution, it's implying that creation is just a belief, you see. Whereas evolution, that's well established. Eugenie Scott's latest book, Evolution and Creationism, that the title is a fallacy. And you open it up and it just goes downhill from there. I'll tell you. Genesis teaches that God created in 6 days. However, the best scientists tell us the universe is billions of years old. The best scientists? How do you know which are the best scientists? Well, obviously the ones that reject creation, you see. And so you see how it begs the question? It's just using emotional language to convey an idea rather than logic. The other subform of begging the question is called complex question. This is where you phrase a question such that it assumes the conclusion. It's begging the question with a question mark. And so it's the interrogative form. Do you still beat your wife? Yes or no? Either yes or no answer implies a conclusion that is logically unwarranted. The question should be divided into two. That's why it's called complex. It should be divided. First of all, did you ever beat your wife? And secondly, if so, do you continue to do so now? So it needs to be divided. Why are you creationists against science? Complex question. Should be divided. Are you against science? If so, why? Which of the two contradictory stories in Genesis do you accept? Well, actually, we don't accept that there are contradictions within the Bible. Anyway, how about this? Have you repented of your sins? Is that a complex question? You know, an evolutionist might say so, or a person who has rejected biblical authority, an unbeliever, he would say, I want that question divided, please. First of all, have I sinned? Second of all, have I repented? In the Christian worldview, however, this is not a complex question because we know that everyone has sinned. And I pointed that out because a lot of times what you consider to be a fallacy will depend upon your worldview. That's something we need to keep in mind. Then we have the no true Scotsman fallacy. This is where you protect a claim from counterargument by defining a term in a biased way, which we call a rhetorical or persuasive definition. And the classic example from which the name is taken is person A says, no Scotsman puts sugar in his porridge. Person B says, well, Angus is a Scotsman and he puts sugar in his porridge. And person A says, but no true Scotsman puts sugar in his porridge. And so he's defining the term Scotsman in a way that's not really legitimate. You don't have to just be a Scotsman, you also have to not put sugar in your porridge to be a true Scotsman. And so you'll see lots of examples of this in evolutionary literature and in blogs and such. No scientist believes that God created 6 days, says the evolutionist. And the creationist says, well, the scientist that answers in Genesis believe that God created 6 days. Well, no real scientist believes that God created in 6 days. No peer-reviewed science journal would accept a creationist paper. Well, the answer is Research Journal accepts creationist papers all the time. Well, no reputable journal would accept a creationist paper. That's the no true Scotsman fallacy. Now, this claim, when you define a term in a biased way like this, it's totally arbitrary and therefore reversible. You need to remember that all arbitrary claims are reversible. I could equally well say, actually, no reputable journal would accept an evolutionist paper. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that, but my point is, I could. If he said that, I can say the opposite. For every arbitrary claim, there's an equal and opposite arbitrary claim. Keep that in mind. It's a great way to refute arbitrariness, just to be arbitrary. Yeah, it works. Then we have fallacies of relevance. This is where the conclusion of an argument is not strongly related to the premises, but it seems at first glance that it would be that way. And there are, for example, ad hominem fallacies. And that, of course, is Latin. It means to the man. In fact, all of the fallacies I've listed here, they all have fancy Latin names, but for the most part, they're not used. But for some reason, with ad hominem, they tend to prefer the Latin there. To the man, where an argument is directed against a person rather than his or her argument, his or her position. And there are a couple of forms of ad hominem. There's the abusive ad hominem, where you attack the character of the person. Joe's a really mean person, so I wouldn't believe anything he says. Okay? Well, just because he's a mean person doesn't mean that he doesn't have a really good argument, okay? If Hitler said 2 + 2 = 4, that wouldn't make it false just because he's a big meanie, right? And then we have the circumstantial ad hominem. This is where you're claiming that an argument is only due to a person's circumstances. You're pointing out that they're motivated to make an argument. And that may be true, but it's irrelevant. So you say to someone, well, you're only for higher gasoline prices because you work at a gas station. You want to get a higher paycheck. Well, maybe that's true. I mean, maybe that is the reason why this person is arguing for higher gasoline prices. But on the other hand, maybe he's got a really good argument for it. I don't know what it would be, but maybe he's got one. The fact that he's motivated to make the argument doesn't mean that the argument is bad, does it? You're just a Christian because you were brought up in a Christian family. Heard people say that? Oh, well, if you were brought up in a Muslim family, you'd be Muslim. That may be. But the fact is, I've got some really good reasons to be a Christian, you see. I've got some reasons to continue to be what I was taught as a child. And I recognize this one because, you see, I get that a lot. I was actually reared in a Christian home, and I thank God for that. But the fact that I was reared in a Christian home doesn't mean that I don't have a great argument for Christianity, like the fact that you can't account for logic or science or morality apart from Christianity. I've got a real good reason for it. The cause of something is not necessarily the same as the reason for something. Right? The cause of my being saved ultimately is the Holy Spirit. But I have reasons for it. I have objective reasons for my faith. But it just doesn't make sense. This fallacy is just not cogent, is it? It'd be like saying, well, you just believe in the multiplication table because you were taught it in school. Well, yeah, I was taught the multiplication table in school, but I've got some really good reasons to believe in the multiplication table, right? So that's a circumstantial ad hominem. Then we have the fallacy of irrelevant thesis. It's when an argument proves a point, But it's not the point at issue. And so the conclusion is irrelevant. Irrelevant thesis, irrelevant conclusion. And here's a silly example. The people who want to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons are mistaken. After all, such an action will not solve all the world's problems. Well, that's true. It won't solve all the world's problems, but that's not the point, is it? The people who want to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons are saying it'll solve some problems, and that's all. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But the point is, this is not relevant to the claim at issue, and so it's the fallacy of irrelevant thesis. It's true, but it's not relevant. And here's some examples that you've probably heard before, but maybe you didn't know they were fallacies. Why is the universe ideally suited for life? Because otherwise we wouldn't be here to observe it. Duh, the anthropic principle, right? Well, that is true, isn't it? It is true that if the universe were not ideally suited for life, we wouldn't be here to observe it. But that really doesn't explain why it's ideally suited for life, and so it doesn't answer the question. It'd be kind of like if I were the sole survivor of a plane crash, and a reporter came in to me and said, Dr. Lyle, why did you survive that crash? I said, well, because if I didn't, I wouldn't be here to answer your question, right? That doesn't answer the question, does it? Why did I survive it? I don't know, but in any case, that's not an answer. Why is the universe ideally suited for life? Because God created it that way, because as a creator. And the fact that we wouldn't be here to observe it otherwise is irrelevant. It's true, but it's irrelevant. Why do living creatures have complex parts that function together so perfectly? Because if they didn't, they would have died off. It is true that if they didn't, they would have died off, but that doesn't explain why they have them in the first place, does it? You know, natural selection does not explain why we find animals that are suited to their environment. It only explains why we do not find animals that are not suited to their environment. Think about that. It's different. Why do we find animals that are suited to their environment? Because God created animals with certain abilities so that they would be well suited to their environment. Yeah, those that aren't die off. That's true. But this isn't an answer to the question. All fallacies of irrelevant thesis can be answered with this simple response. True, perhaps, but irrelevant. True, yeah, it's true. If the universe weren't suited for life, we wouldn't be here to observe it, but that's irrelevant. I'm asking why? Why is it designed for life? We have the straw man fallacy. This is where an argument is directed against a misrepresentation of your opponent's position rather than the actual position. And so as an example of this, creationists believe that God created all the animals as we see them today, but some breeds of dogs are known to be quite recent. So creationists are wrong, you see. Well, the fact is creationists don't believe that God created all the animals as we see them today. So that is a straw man fallacy, straw man argument. Creationists claim that you need to believe in 6 days to be saved, but the Bible doesn't teach that. Well, neither do we, you see. And so that's an example of a straw man fallacy. A straw man is where you take and you misrepresent your opponent's position, you put words in his mouth. You know, creationists, they're flat earthers, they don't believe in science, they don't believe in change. If only these creationists had a brain, right? But he might find it a lot more difficult to refute what we actually say than the words that he's put in our mouth. See, then he's showing how easy it is to knock down that straw man. Then we have faulty appeals, where you appeal to something or someone in a way that is not relevant to the claim. And so as an example, we have appeal to pity. Please, Dr. Lyle, give me an A, because if you don't, my parents will beat me. Well, you should have worked harder then, right? Appeal to fear. If you don't teach evolution at this school, we will fire you, or we will engage in a lawsuit against you if you teach creation. Appeal to fear. Appeal to the mob, where you try to get a lot of people excited about a particular idea. And then the two that I'll cover in detail, appeal to authority and appeal to ignorance. Appeal to authority is where you argue that a claim is true because someone else believes it. And that's a fallacy because people can be wrong about things. And so that's why it doesn't work. And so, for example, Joe is an expert in biology, and he believes in evolution, so it must be true. But the problem with that is for every expert, there's an equal and opposite expert. You could say, well, Bill is an expert in biology, and he believes in creation, so it must be true. You see, now if all the experts agreed on something, it might not be a fallacy to say, well, you know, all the experts, whether they're creationists or evolutionists, they all agree on this. So I think it's very likely that that's true. I think that would not be a fallacy. But to say that something must be true because an expert believes it is a fallacy, particularly if it's not in his field of expertise. What does biology really have to do with what allegedly happened billions of years ago? You ever thought about that? Biology is the study of how the world works today. The study of origins is a history question. Seems to me we ought to consult a historian, especially one that studied the Bible, which is the history book of the universe. So anyway, it's something to think about. So that's an appeal to the one, appeal to an expert. You can also appeal to the many, which is called an appeal to majority. Evolution must be true because how could all those scientists be wrong? I had somebody asked asked me that on one of the blogs on the internet. How could all those scientists be wrong? I answered with one word: sin. Sin. We all have a sin nature. We don't want to accept the biblical God. Would it be a faulty appeal to authority to appeal to the Bible? That's something to think about, isn't it? Because evolutionists will say, well, we appeal to our experts, you just appeal to the Bible. It seems to me the reason, though, that this is faulty, the reason it's a fallacy, is because experts can be wrong, can't they? Can God be wrong? No. And so I don't think there's any fallacy in appealing to someone who is never wrong. I don't think that's a fallacy at all. And then there's appeal to ignorance. This is where you argue that a claim must be true because it has not been proven false. There must be life in outer space. No one has ever proved that there is not, right? And the thing about the appeal to ignorance is it's always reversible. You could say, well, there must not be life in outer space then because no one has proved that there is. You can always turn it around on them. For every arbitrary claim, there's an equal and opposite arbitrary claim. A lack of evidence against a position is not the same as evidence for the position. You need to keep that in mind. Appeals to ignorance are always reversible. Galileo had to deal with this problem. Those of you that attended my astronomy talk the other day, we talked about Galileo and some of his wonderful discoveries. He discovered that the moon was not a perfect sphere, as was commonly believed at the time. It had valleys and craters and canyons and, the surface of the moon, if you've ever seen it in a telescope, it's beautiful and it's kind of a desolate beauty. And this really challenged the people at the time. They came to him and said, oh, that can't be right. We all know the moon's a perfect sphere. Aristotle said that. And so Galileo invited these people to look through his telescope, and they could see the craters and the valleys and the mountains, and they still insisted that the moon was a perfect sphere. They were able to come up with a rescuing device. And you know what they said? They said, well, yeah, we can see those imperfections, but you see on top of that, there's this invisible crystalline sphere that fills in all the holes and valleys, and such that the actual invisible surface of the moon is a perfect sphere. You can't prove it's not there, right? That's an appeal to ignorance. You know how Galileo dealt with that? It's interesting how he dealt with it. He said, okay, there is such a sphere that fills in all the valleys and canyons such that the surface of the moon is smooth, but on top of that, there's another invisible sphere that has mountains and craters. True story. Okay, let's move on to deductive logic now. Deductive logic is the kind that deals with forms, if P then Q, that sort of thing. We've already looked at some of those. We've looked at some of the categorical types of syllogisms. And categorical deductive logic would use words like all, some, no, and not. And there are 256 possible standard categorical syllogisms in terms of the way you can possibly arrange the words. Only 15 of them are valid. The other ones commit one of 6 fallacies. It'd be fun to deal with those, but they don't occur real commonly in apologetic situations, and it would take too long. It'd probably take me a week to teach you categorical logic. So we're just going to do propositional, which deals with if, then, and, or, and not. If this, then that, this or that, not this, therefore that kind of logic, propositional logic. There's a way of combining the two as well called quantized logic. So we're going to deal with just propositional logic, and I'm going to teach you 2 types of propositional logic, two valid arguments, and then 2 fallacies. So that's all we're going to do in the remaining time here. So, and these are what are called mixed hypothetical syllogisms, and it looks like this. If P, then Q, where P and Q are any proposition you can think of. If it's raining, then the grass must be wet, okay? That's a hypothetical statement. If P, then Q. P is true, therefore what? Therefore Q. If P, then Q. If P is true, then Q is true. P is true, therefore Q is true. Real simple syllogism, isn't it? And it's called a mixed hypothetical syllogism because the first statement is hypothetical, if this, then that, and the second statement is not. So it's a mixed hypothetical. And if it's raining outside, that's P, then the grass will be wet, that's Q. It is raining outside, P, therefore the grass will be wet, that's Q. And so that's a perfectly valid mixed hypothetical syllogism. It's called modus ponens, which is Latin meaning the method of affirming. So modus ponens is a perfectly good, valid hypothetical syllogism. Whenever you have a hypothetical statement like that, if P then Q, P is called the antecedent, Q is called the consequence. Sorry to give you so much terminology, but I think it's important that you know these. So when you say this, when you use this particular kind of argument, it's called modus ponens, or in English, affirming the antecedent. Because the second premise here affirms that P, the antecedent, is in fact true. And so that's affirming the antecedent or modus ponens. Either of those names is acceptable. Then we have another mixed hypothetical syllogism. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. If P is true, then Q is true, but Q is not true, therefore P is not true. And how would that work out with words? If it's raining outside, then the grass will be wet, but the grass is not wet, therefore it must not be raining outside. That's pretty easy. And that's also valid. It's called a modus tollens, the method of denying. Method of denying, modus tollens. And it's also called in English the denying the consequent, because you're denying that Q, which is the consequent, you're denying that that's true, so denying the consequent. So those are the two valid forms of mixed hypothetical syllogisms. And then there are two fallacies. And you might think, well, why am I spending all this time in terminology covering these two, just for two fallacies? Because they are very, very common. And here's the first. If P, then Q, not P, therefore not Q. If P is true, then Q is true, but P is not true, therefore Q can't be true either. That doesn't follow. If it's raining outside, then the grass will be wet. But it's not raining outside, therefore the grass can't be wet. That doesn't work, does it? Because maybe somebody threw a bucket of water on it. The grass could still be wet, even though it's not raining outside. And so that is a fallacy. It's an invalid argument. It's called the fallacy of denying the antecedent, because the first term, P, the antecedent, is denied in the second premise, denying the antecedent. Very common in evolutionary arguments. And then the other fallacy is if P, then Q, Q, therefore P. And how would that work with words then? If it's raining outside, then the grass will be wet. The grass is wet, therefore it must be raining outside. But that doesn't follow. Again, maybe somebody left the sprinklers on. There could be lots of reasons why the grass is wet even though it's not raining. And so that is an invalid argument. It's a fallacy, and it's called the fallacy of affirming the consequent. In my opinion, this is the most common fallacy committed by evolutionists. This is number one, and therefore you must remember this, keep it in mind. Because they'll do things like they'll say, you know, according to my theory, if my theory is true, I expect to see this result, and I do see that result, therefore my theory is true. And that's not the case. Incorrect theories occasionally make correct predictions. And so that's why we like to see lots and lots and lots. Now, it would not be fallacious to say, my theory has made millions of correct predictions. All of them have been confirmed, and it's not made a single incorrect prediction, so I think it's very likely that my theory is true. That's fine. That's a perfectly good inductive argument. But to say, my theory predicts this, I do see this, therefore my theory is true, is the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Some examples. Is this valid? Does it sound? If evolution is true, then we'd expect to find similarities in the DNA of all organisms, because we're all related, you see. And we do find similarities in the DNA of all organisms. Therefore, evolution is true. Is that valid? No. It's the fallacy of affirming the consequent. If P, then Q, Q, therefore P. Doesn't follow. That is a fallacy. It's very common. I've heard Eugenie Scott say this. I've heard Richard Dawkins say this. I mean, these people that you would think would know better, but they don't. They commit these fallacies left and right, and you need to watch for that. Here's another one that I encountered in an actual debate with an evolutionist. His name was Jim. He said, sure, if dinosaurs and human fossils were found in the same rock layers, yeah, that would prove that they lived at the same time. But the fact is, we don't find dinosaurs and humans in the same rock layers. Therefore, they did not live at the same time. Is that valid? No. That is the fallacy of denying the antecedent. Okay, just because we don't find them in the same rock layers doesn't mean they didn't live at the same time. Maybe they lived in different areas, for example, normally. How about this one? If there is an order to the fossil record, then evolution must be true. And there is an order to the fossil record. Therefore, evolution must be true. Is that valid? Somebody got it. Yes, it is valid. That's a modus ponens. Very good. So remember, an argument can be bad for two reasons. It can either have a fallacy. This one does not have a fallacy in it. The chain of reasoning is correct. Or an argument can have a false premise. This one has a false premise. Premise number one, if there's an order to the fossil record, then evolution must be true. That is not a correct premise, okay? So be careful. Be careful of accusing someone of committing a logical fallacy when maybe, in fact, they just have a faulty premise. Always watch for that. Okay, I'd like to now show you the necessity of consistency. Now that we've had a little bit of training in logic and in syllogisms and so on and so forth, I want to show you why it's so important that a worldview has no contradictions within it, no inconsistencies, because I pointed out in the last session that the evolutionary worldview is inconsistent with itself, right? It's self-refuting because it depends on things that make no sense in that worldview, like laws of logic and morality and so on. From two contradictory premises, I can validly conclude absolutely anything, no matter how ridiculous it is. And I'd like to illustrate that for you. Suppose you'll allow me these two contradictory statements. Dr. Lyle is teaching a class on apologetics. Well, that's true. But suppose you allow me to also say Dr. Lyle is not teaching a class on apologetics. You're going to allow me to assume that that is also true. Okay? Just for the sake of argument, you're going to allow me one contradiction. From that, I can prove anything. So either Dr. Lyle is teaching a class on apologetics or the moon is made of green cheese is true. Now that is a true statement, isn't it? Either P or Q, because whenever you have P or Q, if either one of them is true, the compound thing is true. But Dr. Lyle is not teaching a class on apologetics, because you gave me that, that's number 2, restated. Therefore, the moon is made of green cheese, okay? From two contradictory premises, I can conclude absolutely any silly thing that I want to. Not a problem. And that's why it's so important that we have to watch for these inconsistencies. Now, this is obvious, right? Because I put them right next to each other, and the inconsistency is obvious. But in an evolutionary worldview, those two contradictory premises might be widely separated, and you're going to have to think about it a little bit. But it would be ridiculous for an evolutionist to say, okay, well, just allow me one inconsistency, and then we can go. No, because from one inconsistency, you can prove anything. You can reach any ridiculous conclusion whatsoever. And you can interpret any evidence as supporting your contradictory premises. For example, suppose that my worldview is people exist and people do not exist. That's my worldview. But that's inconsistent. Well, just go with it. Just give me that inconsistency and I'll show you. I've got plenty of evidence for that worldview because I look in some places and I see people exist. I look in other places, I see people don't exist. So there you go. That's evidence that supports my worldview. Right? No. Because if your worldview is inconsistent, it's wrong, and it doesn't make sense to look for evidence to support something that's intrinsically contradictory. And so that's why it's very important that we must have a self-consistent worldview. Well, let me show you some resources again that I would encourage you to get. In a way, I was a little bit fearful of giving this presentation because it's just sort of a list of fallacies, and I thought, how in the world am I going to make that entertaining? So I hope it wasn't too boring for you. But these fallacies occur in apologetic situations, and therefore it's very important that you learn to identify these fallacies. And boy, if you master spotting logical fallacies, boy, is it going to help your apologetic. It really will, because when an evolutionist commits this, he comes to you and he's all pompous, because sometimes they are. Sometimes they're just really, oh, I'm going to show you creationists what idiots you are. And they commit 3 or 4 logical fallacies, and you say, well, actually, you've committed some logical fallacies there. You've committed the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Let me explain that to you. Boy, does it take the wind out of their sail. It really does. Because they know it. Especially if you give an example of the fallacy, they can say, oh, yeah, that wasn't so logical, was it? And so it's very powerful. There are 2 chapters in my book, Ultimate Proof of Creation, which give you examples of these fallacies, including a lot of the ones that I didn't have time to talk about today. So, some of the other ones like hasty generalization and so on and so forth. So I'd really encourage you to get that book. It's going to train you how to think, really. My goal in this book was to teach people how to think like Christ. Not that I've mastered that by any means, but the more I read Scripture, the more I learn to think and do apologetics biblically, the closer I get